Thank you for joining us today for our training session, AI Governance and Risk, What Every Employee Needs to Know. My name is Donna Bales, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Regulatory Technology Association. For those of you who do not know the Canadian RegTech Association, we're a not-for-profit focused on bringing regulatory bodies, financial institutions, and RegTech firms together to address common challenges through collaborative efforts. The association has been active in artificial intelligence since 2019, leading a number of exclusive forums on AI governance and risk. Our work in AI governance fed into OSFI Edge Principles in 2022. Throughout 2022, we also worked with the Digital Governance Council on a workshop agreement for vendors offering AI and machine learning lifecycle solutions to financial institutions. The workshop agreement covers steps such as establishing a model governance framework, managing risks upfront, and documenting end-to-end data collection and processing, and is the first step towards a formalized national standard. Many of these topics we will be discussing today in today's training. I am here with Carol Poivison, co-founder and principal at INQ Law. Carol plays an active role in shaping data law, policy, and standards in Canada and globally. She is a member of the OECD Policy Observatory and has contributed to a number of governance councils throughout Canada and across the world. Thank you for joining us today, Carol.
Thank you.
So just to discuss today's training, we have split the training into 3 parts. Part 1 will discuss artificial intelligence and what it means, the AI opportunity in financial services, and the legal and regulatory landscape. In part 2, we'll discuss AI risks and how you need to build AI into your existing organizational capabilities and understanding the role of the compliance officer. Finally, in part 3, we move to more practical and share some of the building blocks of a good governance program and discuss some of the artifacts that you will use on a day-to-day basis. So let's start the training. Over to you, Carol.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Donna, and for the opportunity to address the Canadian RegTech community. What we want to do is really kick off with an understanding of how artificial intelligence is really being conceptualized in policy and law that's providing us better guidance in terms of what AI governance is going to look like. So if you haven't heard this term before, AI governance is a term that you will start to hear more and more. And it is a term that explains how organizations are setting themselves up for effective management of high-risk use cases involving artificial intelligence. So just starting with a bit of a definition, while there is no consensus on the definition of what is artificial intelligence, we do draw inspiration from the OECD definition, mainly because it has been consulted upon with many different stakeholders in different countries. But importantly, if you look at the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which is now official and would govern the use of artificial intelligence within the European Union. If you look at the US National Institute of Standards and Technology's AI risk management framework, and you look at the draft law in Canada, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, as just examples, many of those different pieces of law or policy or guidance draw from this definition of artificial intelligence that you see. And so very quickly, the OECD at a very high level has defined AI to include or to mean a transformative technology capable of tasks that typically require human-like intelligence, such as understanding language, recognizing patterns, and making decisions. And this is really important because what we're looking for is that ability for a computer system to process and analyze a tremendous amount of information in a manner that produces intelligence. Even that is a hotly contested term, but produces a pattern or a prediction or an output that is valuable and deemed to be almost human-like intelligence. When we look at generative AI, that really exploded on the scene in or around November 2022 with the commercialization of OpenAI's ChatGPT, a pivotal moment in the commercialization of artificial intelligence and in the development, the sort of sophistication of how these systems are being developed and ultimately used. And when we talk about generative AI, which is typically what we're talking about in this day and age when it comes to AI governance, we're often focusing mostly on governance of generative AI systems. We are looking at those large language models and foundation models that are being used to create what could be deemed to be original content. So whether it's written or audio or visual, it is an output that is certainly processing an enormous amount of data. It is creating something like art or stories or poems or code. And the output is very, at least in a quality perspective, often seems to be very human-like. So it can be increasingly very difficult to tell the distinction between a computer-generated output and a human-generated output. And so with generative AI, that's what we're starting to seize on with the myriad of social and legal issues that come with it. The reality of this rapid augmentation of AI capabilities is that we are finding the public is not catching up with necessarily the same level of excitement as some of those who are in the research and development space for artificial intelligence. Back in 2019, the World Economic Forum identified the trust deficit as a barrier to economic growth, digital innovation, and social cohesion, noting that trust is the ultimate human currency. Many brands, many organizations are in fact elevating that quotient of trust as a determining sort of threshold as to whether or not or how quickly to onboard artificial intelligence and how to do so in a way that really shows responsibility and shows good governance. If we look at the 2024 Stanford AI Index report, it showed that the proportion of those who think AI will dramatically affect their lives in the next 3 to 5 years has increased from 60 to 66%. So we do see an increase in the sort of consciousness of how AI may be used. But then look to the right of the screen where you have some findings from the Pew Research Center that indicates that between 2021, so pre-ChatGPT through to post-ChatGPT era in 2023, we actually have an increasing anxiety with the use of AI and a decreasing excitement. So more individuals polled are concerned with artificial intelligence than they are excited. And if you take that research and you read the remainder of it, you will find that one of the elements that is causing this anxiety is this notion that we don't know how to effectively govern artificial intelligence, whether it's policymakers who are making the policies or organizations who are using the systems. There is a general concern among those polled that those who are in those positions of power aren't necessarily well equipped to deal with the complexity of this technology. And so with all of the excitement and all the possibility and all the discussion about artificial intelligence, we really have to be mindful of the impact on individuals and whether they're ready for this level of adoption.
And there is a tremendous amount of opportunity with AI, and I think that everybody recognizes that. But that importance, that governance framework that Carol spoke about, is so important in order to manage those risks. But to speak a little bit to the opportunity, what does it really help do? It helps manage complex data sets. It helps to solve challenging problems. And the drivers behind AI are many, but three ones that stand out are that customers desire to interact at a digital level. We've had a big change in terms of the availability of infrastructure, particularly compute and the cloud. And we also have regulators that are looking for more accurate reporting in a timely manner. So in financial services, there are a number of new user cases, but to call out a few of them, process automation, automating this data collection process, improving the speed of which decisions are being made, and enhancing organizations' readiness to meet regulatory compliance obligations. It's also been widely used in fraud detection and prevention, to look at transactional data, to look for patterns and data anomalies, and suspicious relationships between individuals and entities. You'll all recognize that you're seeing more chatbots. So it helps organizations engage with their customers more at a 24/7 level so that they can open up accounts and have online conversations at their convenience. And it's also providing different relationship management techniques with customers through different logon options, such as voice commands or facial recognition. The other big use case for AI and machine learning is predictive analytics, as it opens up the door for much more accurate forecasting and prediction, such as stock market price predictions, risk monitoring, risk forecasting, algorithmic trading, and portfolio allocation. So to recap, the opportunity is efficiency and effectiveness, improved decision-making, improving the accuracy and precision of decision-making. It improves financial competitiveness. It helps improve intelligent offerings for your clients, and process automation. We're talking also throughout this course around generative AI. And in financial services, Gen AI provides enormous opportunities. One of the biggest use cases is around searching and synthesizing large data sets. So if you're in corporate finance or in cap markets where you need to collect disparate data on market risk or investment firm data, ratings, you can collect that unstructured data in a more efficient fashion and rapidly put it to use. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, just on some particular use cases that are being applied in Gen AI right now. So we know all the banks are testing it. They're in their test labs looking for those opportunities and process efficiencies, but some banks are actually applying it right now. A few examples I'm going to note here is TD. TD is using it to help employees in their contact center respond more quickly. So they have an internal virtual assistant that helps get information from policies and procedures and helps to respond to those chat box queries much more efficiently. Also, we have many banks that are using GitHub Copilot to accelerate code deployment. So this is helping to assist engineers to analyze their code and rewrite, and also offer suggestions for completing and testing it. Another great use case here is Morgan Stanley, that is using it in wealth management. Provided they get client consent, they are using their Gen AI tool to listen into a conversation and debrief translate the conversation into a debrief and actions, and then this gets passed back to the client and also gets archived into Salesforce. So this is a great efficiency example because there's no longer need a note taker, and you free up a lot of the advisor time. So just passing it back to you, Carol, to speak a little bit on the policy.
So we've got these great use cases. We understand the opportunity that is AI. And yet we still see this anxiety with the use of AI. And so what do we, what exactly is this anxiety related to in part? And why do we have AI governance and how is it being structured? That's where I spend a lot of my time. It is unpacking for organizations that are embarking or well into their AI journey how to stand up effective governance structures. And I know we're going to get to that in more detail in part 3. But let's just start with some of those first principles, which is so important when we try to create a proper framework for AI governance. So the first question is, we know that there are different draft or now on the books laws that are governing artificial intelligence. There are different ways that guardrails are being put in place around those AI applications, those high-risk AI applications. We have self-regulation models, which is where guidance is provided by policymakers or policy institutes that give us a sense of what kinds of guardrails we could set up within our own organization. And that's an example of that is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, a comprehensive framework. It is totally voluntary to use, but it provides very good guidance in terms of how to structure an AI governance program. We then have elements of hard law. So for instance, the EU AI Act that I referenced earlier, which is a comprehensive piece of legislation. It is prescriptive in what needs to be done based on who you are in the AI, supply chain and what type of application you'll be using that system for. And then really unpacking what are the expectations throughout the life cycle of the AI use case in order to demonstrate that you are being diligent in risk management and you are being diligent in identifying potential harms on people, property, environment. So that's the hard law. Then we also turn to standards. And for instance, the International Standards Organization has put out a standard 4201 that is an AI management standard. And we look to that to get some sense of what could be considered best practices, even at this early stage of AI governance. And when we think about not only what are the different avenues through which guardrails are being discussed and described, we also want to understand what is the content, what is substantively, what are the guardrails trying to protect against? And in that sense, we look at the key focus areas for policymakers. We know that policymakers are worried about artificial intelligence being able to do through the back door, which you're not allowed to do through the front door. Meaning, if you are not allowed to, do mass surveillance without appropriate, permits or licenses or consents, you're not allowed to do it with artificial intelligence. There's a distinct concern that we will be using these systems to subvert our values as opposed to endorse our values. In addition, there's significant concern with the use of artificial intelligence to perpetuate bias and discrimination, whether that's through an unintended consequence or it's intended. There has to be a significant investment in understanding whether the system is trained on a data set that is inappropriate for the intended use and or ultimately exposed to data sets that are tweaking or changing the output such that they produce discriminatory outcomes that are unjustifiable. We worry about the possibility of unintended consequences through these evolutionary systems and the impact on human control. Is there a way, or to what extent do we have appropriate controls in place to ensure appropriateness of the system, appropriateness of the output, and where something is happening that should not be happening, an appropriate decommissioning system? We worry about elements of safety and security. Are the systems well developed? Are they professionally done by people who know what they're doing? And are they secure? Are we protecting them against the possibility of adverse attacks on these systems that can have very harmful outcomes? Again, with that notion of professionalism in design, do we have the right people working on the right types of AI systems? And do we have the right people thinking through and ultimately implementing these systems in a context of their intended use? Policymakers are distinctly worried about and thoughtful of the accountability structure that's in place within an organization that is purporting to use AI systems in a high-risk context. So what type of accountability structure do you have in place within your organization? And are you telling stakeholders that are impacted by these systems about the system, about the use of the system, and what avenues or mechanisms they may have to object to the use of these systems where appropriate? It's not required always, but it may be appropriate in certain circumstances. And then, of course, we have a lot of third-party systems that are being developed and sold within the marketplace. And that creates new considerations for the relationships between the purchaser and the vendor of AI systems, really thinking about where is liability being borne, who is providing ongoing monitoring and hosting of those systems, and a myriad of other IP data related issues. Those issues aren't new, but they are certainly being augmented or reconsidered within the context of high-risk AI use cases. So these are this is a high-level snapshot of not only the mechanisms through which guardrails are being defined and described, but also substantively, what are some of the issues that we're particularly mindful of. And when we look internationally, we can see that there are a number of different laws that are popping up around the world that are touching on the topic of AI. Not all necessarily are seeking to govern AI. In some instances, we see laws around the world that are indicating a commitment to establish an AI governing council, for instance, but jurisdictions such as the EU, in the US at the state level, we've seen this in Colorado, certainly in Canada, we have draft law that are specifically targeting the governance of those high-risk AI use cases and AI systems. And so this particular diagram comes from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and it's a helpful visualization of how different laws are emerging around the world. When we look at the Canadian regulatory space, I'm going to spend a minute here and then I'll turn it over to you, Donna, to talk about E23 in particular. But important to say that we do have draft law in Canada, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which is still part 3 of the Digital Charter Implementation Act that is very much being considered clause by clause reading at this point in committee. So we're not sure exactly where it will go, but we understand the spirit of what the law is trying to do. And at some point we can anticipate either this law passing or a new law being introduced that is still trying to get at that governance of high impact systems as defined in Canada. But in addition to this, we've seen a number of key developments and investments by the government in AI, Canada being the first country to come out with a national AI strategic plan in 2017 with a number of commitments and investments that are either deployed or now under consideration through new announcements. And then we've seen sectoral approach to AI governance. So for instance, Health Canada issuing guidance on software as a medical device. It's not law, but it is being baked into regulation. And it is guidance to the industry in terms of how best to govern medical devices that include artificial intelligence in their devices themselves, as well as the OSFI guidance that I know you're going to be speaking about, Donna.
Yes, the OSFI guideline, E23 is an example of an existing law that needed to be updated. So it was expanded to not only be a guideline for federally regulated institutions, but also now includes private pension funds, deposit-taking institutions, and federally regulated insurance companies. So we already had a model risk guideline in place, but because of the introduction of AI and the new risks it introduced, it was very important for it to be updated. But what does this revised framework entail? First of all, it recognizes that there is a increased reliance on AI and machine learning for decision-making. And it emphasizes the importance of high quality data to ensure that models are accurate and fit for purpose. And now that AI and machine learning is being incorporated in many products and services, this guideline really stresses that it is the responsibility of the FERFIs, the federally regulated institutions, to be responsible for their third parties, as Carol had just mentioned. Organizations are required to establish a model risk framework that is suitable for both external models and that is consistent with what they do internally. So that has to be very much worked hand in hand. In practice, this can be challenging due to the pace of change and the lack of visibility of third-party processes. This will require organizations to seek out adequate documentation to understand model design and underlying data, including any proprietary elements. So we can't stress that third-party relationship more. It also introduces a definition around, for a model. The model definition is very broad. It has a data, if it's has a data input, it has a processing component, and it has a result, it's considered a model. So this will put a lot of rigor to governance and risk departments to really look at their risk ratings and ensure that there are appropriate controls for each model and AI system. So just digging a little bit further into this regulation, there's a lot of focus on the model lifecycle management. So making sure that there are appropriate and controls along the model lifecycle from development down to decommissioning. And this must be well understood within the organizations. And organizations are expected to manage model risk in alignment with their risk profile and the complexity and size of their organization. This guideline requires a comprehensive framework that reflects an organization's risk appetite and processes for managing, monitoring, and reporting model risk, and that developers have and reviewers have the appropriate risk skill set. The guideline necessitates a centralized model for a centralized model risk inventory and the development of policies for each phase of the model lifecycle. So this should include risk classification, validation status, performance monitoring results, to name a few. The model process must be governed and have clear accountability and rules of oversight. And so this is across the whole model life cycle, from owners, developers, reviewers, approvers, users, and all stakeholders. And I want to just emphasize here that the guideline really stresses data governance. And there are a lot an organization needs to think about to ensure that they have the proper data governance processes along the life cycle. And this will include, especially related to bias, completeness of data, data quality, and that most importantly, that data is fit for purpose for its intended use. Pass that back to you, Carol.
Great. So this takes us through to part 2 now. And it's really unpacking some of those AI risks, building on making sure that we can assist all the audience to sort of understand what are the different artifacts and pieces of AI governance, and understanding in particular the role of compliance professionals. I want to just give a quick overview, and then Donna, I know that we wanted to have a little discussion around this, but just at a very high level, what is really important to understand from this slide is that there are different buckets, different components that typically make their way and find their way into the law. So they are the sort of data assessments, the model assessments, and then the ongoing controls throughout the life cycle of the AI system. And that's typically the way we structure and we think about what our high-level AI governance framework ought to look like. But Donna, I open it up to you for a few questions there.
Yeah, we thought we'd make a little bit interactive here and ask a few questions. And I'm just going to start off with on the topic of ethics, because this was introduced in OSFI's EDGE principles, and so they are emphasizing it in their guidelines. What do you think is the role ethics plays in AI governance?
It plays a very important role in helping us assess what is a high impact versus low impact system. So when you think about what you are going to be governing when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's not every single use case. It is a use case where the possibility of downstream harm to or unfair treatment to person, to their rights, to similarly situated rights. It could be to environment that is now being baked in more and more to AI governance or to property. This is where we start to establish a distinction in whether or not we will have oversight over that use case or not. So typically we say AI, the definition of AI helps you determine whether you're going to enter the AI regime. Once you're in, you have to decide whether this is a high risk or low risk use case. And ethics helps with that determination. So what's really important to understand is, what capabilities you have for an ethics assessment within your organization and what talent you have that is competent to assess different questions of ethics. But it certainly helps in establishing the threshold question, whether the application, the use case is high risk or lower risk. It also helps with the overarching risk management framework that you will have in place to govern that higher risk use case. So we will think about questions of ethics when we come up with not only our risk registry, but also our risk mitigation measures.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought the topic up of the use case, and because this is a really important concept, because the risk should be applied based on the use case of that model or system, and you can't emphasize that enough, because how you manage the risk, it really is highly dependent on whether it's a customer facing application or it's just a back end process application. And so I know in our discussions in our forums, we're always taking it back to the use case, and it's an important thing for the people in this training to remember. You also mentioned monitoring earlier, and but with transparency is a very important element in terms of model risk management. What role does it play in that whole monitoring piece and oversight?
Transparency is very important. It is a mechanism both in terms of how you engage your stakeholders and the extent to which you are putting out there in the world that there are models being used to support certain decisions, make certain decisions, inform certain decisions. So in that sense, transparency is important for your external stakeholders, although there is a strategic discussion to be had about the content and the extent of transparency. And that is certainly an important consideration for internal discussions. It's also important internally, so that within the organization, there's a much stronger sense of how the organization is starting to leverage artificial intelligence and what are the potential implications. So if we go back to that Pew research, a lot of anxiety also has to do with the use of AI in a way that could render an element of the workforce redundant. And there is a lot of insecurity about the sort of oncoming mass automation of our workforce. And so how do we onboard these capabilities without stressing our workforce and ideally upskilling our workforce to be able to really play to their highest value? So that's where those are two examples of where transparency become really critical. In addition, understanding what is the nature of that model that you're using and really assessing whether that model is appropriate for the intended use. Specifically, when we think about questions of explainability and whether the model is able to provide some kind of interpretable output such that we can defend or demonstrate how the functioning of the model has produced a particular output.
Yeah, and we talk about criticality, and I want to turn to data. So you work with a lot of clients. How are you seeing organizations enhance their their data governance processes?
You know, you said it, Donna, right in reviewing the E23 guidelines. Data governance is becoming far more important, more than ever before. So we used to talk a lot about, there are some organizations that are quite mature in their data governance processes, and it's fantastic to see because they are well set up to use artificial intelligence. But most, or many, I shouldn't say most, many have not undertaken the important processes for establishing good data hygiene and good data governance practices. And that is problematic when you're trying to now start using a very data intensive computer system that is artificial intelligence. If you don't have good data, your outputs through this system will not be of good quality. AI is not magic, right? So whatever you feed it is what it will produce. And if it's not good, then the output will not be great. So we are seeing a doubling down on broader data management and data governance practices that are taking the role of the data governance officer far more seriously than ever before.
Yeah, and the model validation has always been a part of E23 and a very important element. But now we've got generative AI use case in the mix. Are you seeing any techniques for testing generative AI that organizations are using that have been effective?
Well, I think when it comes to Gen AI, what I'm seeing from sort of the legal policy lens is more of an investment in providing education and guidance as to the particular risks with generative AI, but also how it can be safely used. So we're seeing more and more the acceptable use policy regarding generative AI. We're seeing the explanation of these models that are permeating outside of the IT or model risk sort of groupings outside those silos, so that it is becoming much more institutionalized within the organization, how these systems, what they are, how they could be used, and then where there are some distinct risks. Specifically, often identifying use cases that are acceptable, but more often than not, use cases that are prohibited and behaviors that are prohibited with the use of these systems. So that's typically where we're seeing, from my perspective, more capabilities within the organization to address generative AI enterprise-wide.
Yeah, and we're going to dig in more to that later in the training. So Carol, that's a great segue, talking about the acceptable use policy, because now we're actually moving to the more practical element of the training program, where we're going to look at some of the building blocks of an effective AI governance program, and particularly looking at artifacts, and really kind of digging into what employees really need to know in their day-to-day. So we're just going to start off here. Carol, if you could just explain some of these key artifacts that every organization should have.
So what you see here is different pieces of the AI governance playbook that are becoming much more common within any, particularly enterprise clients that we have. So the AI policy is the overarching governance document that provides direction as to what we mean by AI. Then typically it will include elements that you see here. For instance, it will include guidance on the acceptable or unacceptable uses of artificial intelligence. It will include the description of the different artifacts that come to bear in the AI governance process. And it will also give clarity as to when AI governance is even triggered, because there is a lot of apprehension, particularly within financial institutions, about creating new policies and new governance structures, given that there's already so much that's in place. And that is super important to bear in mind. So when we talk about AI governance, we are not talking about necessarily the creation of a whole new body of governance. Rather, taking what you already have in place from your data governance, your model risk management, your privacy, your IT, you're looking at the sort of realm, the governance world that you have available to you for your data assets and your model assets, and applying a specific targeted lens to determine where there are gaps in your governance structure based on what your AI ambitions look like. So consider specific use cases, create that inventory of use cases for the 3 to 5 year period. It doesn't even have to be that long necessarily. And then you're looking at how do you close the gap between existing governance infrastructure and where you want to be with your AI ambitions. And so the AI policy will help articulate all of that, including obviously defining what roles and responsibilities different members of the organization have in implementing the overall AI policy. The AI Risk Committee comes in many different names. So you might hear it as the AI Ethics Review Board, the AI Risk Committee, the AI Ethics Committee. It really doesn't matter what you call it, but it is that function that we find is often a gap. So having done a number of these different gap assessments with clients already, we find one area where there is typically a gap in financial institutions. It's in that ethics review that we just talked about. So we have lots of capability in privacy. We have lots of capability in data governance. We have lots of capability in innovation, and the business owners know what they want to do. But when it comes to being able to assess for ethics, often that is a gap where we may not have that talent. So we want that oversight committee with a clear escalation path for where we have those higher risk use cases that come forward, where we want to be using this technology, but we want to do so safely and responsibly. So the committee will have usually the charter or the mandate to properly run that risk assessment on the use case, and then determine what type of escalation path is required, if any at all. Also will likely approve whatever the risk mitigation plan looks like. The AI risk assessment is a specific targeted risk assessment to help uncover where there are particular risks in the use case that's being defined, completely with sort of law and policy in mind. So we really want to be targeted here. We want to be specific to what is the AI related risk. And we are thinking very much of that use case where we, anticipate there being a downstream harm that we need to account for. And maybe, depending on where you are in the world, a law that might apply to governing that, or guidance that might apply to governing that type of use case. The vendor assessment is, as I mentioned earlier, there's more and more onboarding of third-party AI vendors. And how do we consider where there are specific risks in that supply chain? Because we know that that's making its way into the law as well. And what do we do about those risks? So how are we going to either contract or through other mechanisms account for the risks of the AI vendor and be clear about what our expectations are for throughout the life cycle of the AI system? And so we'll see an AI vendor assessment that might really be just augmenting the existing assessment that you have in place through your procurement process. Or in some instances, there may be something that is distinct and separate. More often than not, we see it integrated into the existing procurement process.
So if we dig a little bit further into the AI policy, I know you actually have comprehensively spoke about it, but I think, in certain instances, when you think about an organization, like if you're a model developer or you're in product management, your role will be fairly clear. It'll be defined in your role and in what you do every day. But what about those employees that sit in the periphery? So they're not in compliance, they're not in risk, they're not in tech, but they're just general employee at an organization. What should they know and be aware of on a day-to-day basis? What should they keep in mind?
Yeah. I mean, when we think about what your digital literacy curriculum might look like, it's from our, what I think is quite valuable is to really be able to understand, why are we talking about AI? Why do we care about artificial intelligence as an area for discussion? What are the distinct risks? And then how do we protect those risks? So in this case, when I'm talking about risks, I might be thinking about, the allure of using a downloadable free AI system for work-related purposes. And the possibility that you're now sharing confidential business information with a third-party vendor who is permitted through their terms of use to do whatever they want with that information and who is not going to protect that information in any particular way. Like, that's the sort of education that we want, everyday employees to be mindful of. ChatGPT is amazing. It's super interesting, but there are risks associated with the use of its systems, and we have to be alive to those risks. And there are certain things the enterprise can do, the organization can do to mitigate some of those risks. They might buy a specific license, they might, which might be more containerized, and it might be safer in that respect to use the organization's data, in which case the everyday employee needs to know that, and they need to know only to use those enterprise approved vendors and nobody else. So they should be restricted from using any other sort of free AI vendor that you could just download online. So that's some of the guidance that you will find within the AI policy, in addition to answering some of the questions that you see here on the slide.
Yeah, and we actually covered a good example earlier when we were talking about Morgan Stanley, right? Like, so yeah, great tool that to synthesize your meeting information, but if your client didn't consent to using their information, you're in breach. So that's a kind of example, right. Like, so that having that consent and I like how you've really emphasized throughout the session about that acceptable use policy, what is acceptable and what is not, and really understanding that. I think that's a really good building block for just the general employee to know, and to know where that policy is as well in their organization, because it's not only that it exists, but where it is, where they can access it.
Excellent point. That's an issue that we see people stumbling upon all the time.
Yeah. Okay, so now turning to the risk committee, and I know like previously you went through this, and this is really important, and you've also talked earlier about how it's being embedded with existing committees, but when you kind of get to this committee level, how have you seen, like, what are some of the practices on evaluating use cases at the committee level? What goes on there?
All right, so the first thing that goes on is you have a cross-functional team. So the number one thing we have to bear in mind is that you cannot have just your technology people sitting in that committee. It is not just a technology committee. So you want to have, as I mentioned earlier, your legal, your privacy, your compliance and risk. You're going to want some of the business owners. In fact, whoever's the champion of this use case, you're particularly going to want to make sure that they're there. And you're going to want somebody or peoples that have more training in sort of assessing issues of ethics as defined within the organization. So the first thing that you want on that committee is a cross-functional team. You also want it to be connected to other relevant committees. So you'll want to draw from model risk and data governance. And if you have a privacy committee, then you'll want to draw from that as well. So you do want to have that expertise, and you want the right stakeholders sitting at the table. Then the committee has to be mindful and know what questions to ask to assess the use case. Some of that you can draw from external guidance. Some of that has to come from within, how you define your own risk appetite and your own risk parameters. So they're going to need to know what questions to ask, but more importantly, or as importantly, they need to know what to do with the answers. So once you get the answers, where does that situate the use case? Does it mean that it needs escalation? Or at what point is escalation triggered? To whom is it escalated, or to which committee within the organization? And then at what point does it, potentially go back for further reconsideration to the business owner who initially brought this forward? So that's the role of the committee. In addition, because the regulatory and policy framework or landscape is so fluid right now, we want somebody who has their eyes on this.
Yeah.
So the committee is well situated to appoint somebody to keep their eye on the changes that are happening within the policy sphere. Increasingly, we are seeing the role of the chief AI officer emerging, and that role has specifically, one of the key tasks is to create those cross-functional teams, make sure there's translation across them, and determine whether or not there's any new guidance that's relevant to the organization. So all of that is important for the committee to bear in mind and to socialize within the organization.
Yeah, like every typical risk committee, you're balancing the opportunity with the risk, and
Exactly.
And it's such an important balance. And I like how you emphasize so important that we have all those important players in privacy, because as you move to more customer-facing use cases, it is so important that you get that balance right, and you don't create, like, just by being driven too much by the opportunity, you don't create more risk, and you create that balance and you make the right decision at that level.
Exactly.
It's so important. This committee, and I assume it was, as we learn more, the makeup will evolve, and every organization probably has a slightly different pattern, or within their organization. But I like how you stress so much about the importance of it, because it's if an organization wants to take advantage of the opportunities of AI, this has to be in place.
I think that's right. I think, and if you want to take advantage of the opportunity without landing on the cover of the, whatever newspapers in your jurisdiction, you absolutely want to make sure that you've got the appropriate oversight. And then also, do you have the right risk mitigation measures in place? Like, so do you have a good action plan for how you're going to go ahead with this higher risk use case?
Yeah. And which is a good segue into risk assessment in our next slide, which typically organizations will do the risk assessment at the beginning of a project, at the beginning of a new vendor relationship. For example, you're doing a risk assessment, super important. But I want to talk about how organizations should be doing risk assessments post-deployment, because that is where I think that we'll get tripped up if organizations do not have that regular assessment. Tell me what your thoughts are on that, and how you're seeing organizations.
No, I agree. I mean, look at any law or guidance on artificial intelligence consistently across the board. It's taking a life cycle approach, meaning it's not one and done. You don't do one risk assessment and then it's over, but you have different markers for where the risk is being monitored and reconsidered. And there's a regular review cycle for that risk. A risk assessment doesn't need to be 200 pages of detailed writing in prose, right? Like, we can make it much more practical. And, there can be, the way we've structured it with some of our clients is we'll have a triage, like an initial triage, a very short initial risk assessment or triage assessment to help determine whether or not a more detailed risk assessment is needed. And then you go ahead with the more detailed risk assessment where flagged. And really there, it's trying to be specific to the AI risks. So go back to that slide where we talked about what the policymakers are worried about. Many of those different bullet points indicate what we're trying to protect against, at least at law. Then within an organization, there may be other factors. In fact, there will be other factors that you're considering from a risk appetite and an overall sort of risk posturing perspective. So that's what the risk assessment is trying to do. And then it helps you set up what your mitigation measures look like, so that if something does go wrong, at least you can say, you can demonstrate that you turned your mind to the hard issues, the hard questions, and you tried to address them as best you could with the information you had and with regular monitoring in place. Those higher risk use cases, just to bring it back to the earlier slide, they will be monitored by the AI committee as well. That should have oversight throughout the life cycle of those high risk use cases.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that connection between the initial risk assessment and the control framework, because it's so important, and it's instrumental for that ongoing monitoring. I think finally we've got some on the next slide. We've got some of the other areas that vendor assessment. So the vendor assessment, really important. I think we've touched upon this quite a lot, but is there something else you want to emphasize here on the vendor assessment?
I think it's really just what you see here. So the questions that you need to be aware of as you consider your vendor assessment, really being mindful of targeted questions regarding sort of the AI related risks and the roles and responsibilities that we see being defined in different laws. In particular, I would flag the EU AI law, the EU AI Act, that has different requirements depending on who you are within that supply chain. So important to discuss with compliance, risk, and certainly with legal.
It's so important for the banks, but it's also important for the vendors to understand the rigor that the banks need to go through because they are ultimately responsible for the risk. So for vendors in the audience, they should try to understand what's involved in a risk assessment so that they can be proactive and be proactive and help they will help them secure their next the contract if they're very mindful of the risk that the FI has to be assessed by, because the rigor at the regulatory level with third-party risk is very high.
I agree. I always say to my clients that are on the vendor side, if you want to shorten the sales cycle, show up mature. So know what your client is going to be worried about and be ready to answer the questions you know they're going to ask.
Yeah. And so then finally, we just have a final slide just talking about other components of the AI governance program. And I know we've talked quite a lot about training and education. We've also talked about ongoing monitoring quite a bit. I did want to for you to just comment a little bit on the notice and disclosure for your AI. Can you just explain that a little bit to the audience?
Absolutely. So again, this is all use case dependent. It really can depend on what is the intention of the use of that AI system. But you had raised the example of chatbots earlier. I was actually earlier today, I was looking at a company that had put out training on their AI system, and they had a summary of what the training should look like. And then at the bottom, they had this little box that said, part of the summary has been generated by AI. And someone has looked at it to determine that it's appropriate. So, that's sort of the idea. If you go back not long ago, we knew the Air Canada case involving a chatbot that had given misdirection to an individual seeking, recourse under their bereavement policy. And ultimately, Air Canada was required, despite the chatbot saying one thing, Air Canada said another, and the finding by the tribunal was in favor of effectively what the chatbot said to the individual in first instance for a number of different reasons. And yet, if you really think through how people are interacting with these AI systems, if there are appropriate disclosures as to the limitations of these systems, where they could be faulty, where you might need to seek additional information to verify what the system is saying, if you have appropriate notice and disclosure as to when they are being used, so people know how much to rely on them or not, and you might even indicate that as well. That goes into your overall consideration as to notice and disclosure. So that's part of the discussion that you're going to be having in that AI committee for sure, when it comes to those higher risk use cases, particularly when they're interfacing to provide some kind of direct advice, right? You're going to be really mindful of what that looks like. In some contexts, you might be required to have the person opt in to the use of that system, or at least give them the option to opt out of the use of an automated system or an AI system to make certain decisions.
Yeah, I think this will be a topic that will evolve, but I think it's very important for the people to understand on the training here. So that is the end of our training. Carol and I are just going to walk through some of the key takeaways. Maybe Carol, you could start with the top 4, and then I'll close out.
Absolutely. So we know that generative AI in particular, but AI is skyrocketing, not only in financial services, but we do flag financial services because we see a distinct increase in the use of these systems. I will say that from what I am hearing from boards, whenever I do board training, this is becoming an existential question for organizations. If we're not leveraging in a wise, responsible way, artificial intelligence, is this an existential threat to our organization? We do see guardrails that are coming up that are helping us better manage the AI context. And we can see that, for instance, in Bill C-27 as one example of guardrails that are in place for those high impact AI systems. Another example of considerate guidance is through OSFI's E23, which is still in draft form. We need the final version to come out, but certainly expanding the guidance for model risk management to specifically account for AI-related risks, and financial institutions having to bear that in mind, in particular for themselves, obviously, but also in their interactions and in their relationships with third-party AI vendors.
And we want to emphasize that the traditional a traditional risk program is changing. AI is changing that. Generative AI specifically, it introduces new risks to fairness, bias, explainability, accountability, and robustness. So your risk program needs to consider all of these and kind of trail back to that use case. AI governance and risk builds on your existing capabilities. You don't need new ones. You build on your existing one. Your organization already has data governance and risk management mechanisms. You just need to expand it for AI. The role of the risk and compliance employee is evolving, and you play a key role in managing the AI-related risks. And I would just take that a little bit further. It's not just the risk and compliance employee, it's everybody in the organization needs to understand the risk and be mindful of it because of the way generative AI is increasing, like the availability of AI in everyday interactions. And then key artifacts to remember: your AI policy, especially that acceptable use policy, that you will have an AI risk committee in your organization that is looking at those user cases, that you'll have an AI risk assessment, and that will be continually updated, that you'll have the importance of an AI vendor assessment, and that is a very important element if you are in procurement or in product development, that your organization will have AI training and education, and that you should take advantage of any extra education that they offer. And that ongoing monitoring and reporting is very important, that this notice of disclosure, that you're going to start seeing that in more and more in your everyday interaction, whether you're in work or outside of work. And then also this element of technical testing of AI systems. That's a really important element in organizations that are building AI models and systems for their customers. So that is the end of our training today. I hope you all enjoyed it. There will be a quiz afterwards. I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank Carol for joining me in this session, and we hope to see you again at another one of our activities or another training session.